Okay, watching UFC. This is 10-time UFC threw their stars under the bus. Let's go straight.
A promoter's job is right there in the name. They're supposed to promote. They puff up their biggest stars and make them seem like the best thing ever. Look how many times Dana has called someone the pound-for-pound best in the world when their big fight is coming up. And White is the best promoter this sport has ever seen by a huge margin. But he and the UFC also have this weird tendency to absolutely bury their champions when they do something that pisses them off. While arguably justified at times, and in other scenarios just petty as hell, today we're going to look at times the promoter did anything but.
Our guys are so dumb, it's next level unbelievable.
I'm Tommy from MMA On Point. A massive thank you to our channel Hall of Famers for their continued support, and this is 10 times the UFC threw their stars under the bus. Number 10, George St. Pierre. There were quite a few people understandably upset after GSP was given the decision victory over Johnny Hendricks in their now infamous welterweight title bout, but nobody was seemingly more upset than Dana White, even though he admitted that he should have been happy considering St. Pierre was the sport's biggest draw. But his sense of fairness had him fired up. That and GSP had said in the cage that he was going to go away for a while. Yeah, Dana was having none of that and went in on St. Pierre at the presser.
You don't just say, hey, I'm going to take a while off and maybe I'll be back, maybe I won't. You owe it to the fans, you owe it to that belt, you owe it to this company, and you owe it to Johnny Hendricks to give him that opportunity to fight again.
What's interesting about this moment is that White admitted his confusion over what it is that was even happening with St. Pierre to prompt this statement. But that did not stop him from making GSP sound like some kind of piece of shit for holding up the division and thinking he could just go fuck off for a few years.
George St. Pierre lost the urge to fight. And that's the reality. He lost the urge to fight.
But I gotta tell him something like to Dana. He doesn't know anything about me.
Sure, the judges made the mistake, but White made it clear that GSP was letting everybody down, including the fans. St. Pierre did fuck off for a few years, of course, after vacating the title. And while Dana was understandably upset in the moment, he didn't do his champion any favors at that press conference. Number 9, Amanda Nunes. You wouldn't think it these days, as Nunes is one of Dana White's all-time favorite fighters.
I love the kid. She's been incredible to work with, and obviously the greatest female fighter of all time.
He even has a big image of her running around with her 2 belts adorning his office at UFC HQ, but when you fuck with the UFC's money, they tend not to like that. And man, they were not happy with Nunes pulling out of UFC 213. The rematch between Amanda and Valentina Shevchenko was set to headline the International Fight Week card, but the morning of the event, Nunes was forced off due to an illness.
You know, her eyes weren't focusing. We brought the CAT scan to 4 specialists, and they're all like, she's messed up.
Losing your biggest show of the year's main event the day of the card isn't exactly ideal, and as you can imagine, the UFC wasn't too happy about it. But they did nothing in protecting their champion and her reasoning for the pullout.
She was medically cleared. I think that it was 90% mental and maybe 10% physical.
I mean, does that concern you moving forward? Like, can I put this woman in the main event slot? And
Yeah, I won't do that again.
So, in no uncertain terms, the UFC's stance was that Amanda just didn't feel like fighting and decided not to. At least that's how it came across there. She headlined UFC 215 that fall and 4 more events in the years after. Number 8, Tom Aspinall. If you've not been paying attention to the sport as of late, fans are not super happy that reigning defending interim heavyweight champion Tom Aspinall will not be next fighting for the undisputed title against John Jones, who has been out for 500 plus days, because he'll be fighting Stipe Miocic, who has been out for 1,200 plus days.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
Many feel that Jones should have been stripped at some point and Aspinall promoted to undisputed. But the UFC is adamant that John versus Stipe must happen, lest the 2 timelines remain split and Marty is forever stuck in a hill valley destroyed by Biff. While discussing the matter with Kevin Iole, Dana White went on to talk about how special Tom is.
There's no doubt. I mean, this guy is a scary dude, and he looks like the future.
Before absolutely burying him for absolutely no reason.
He's working his way up. He's climbing up the ladder, and everybody's like, he deserves this and he deserves that. He doesn't deserve anything.
The internet collectively lost their shit over these statements, making Aspinall sound like some kind of blue chip prospect who might main event an Apex card soon if he's lucky, rather than someone who has an arguably more legitimate claim to the heavyweight crown at the moment than Jones does, who beat Cyril Gahn, who earned his shot at the then vacant gold by beating Tai Tuivasa. And the reason that belt was vacant was because the champion who just beat Gahn left the promotion. Not exactly the strongest title reign ever. Dana did say that his hope is that the Jones-Miocic fight makes the unification bout a bigger deal, but I just don't see how it does in any way. And while the kids these days are talking about Dana glazing bones, you don't have to go too far back to when he was doing whatever is the opposite of glazing. Number 7, Jon Jones. Yes, this narrative has changed drastically these days given the position of Jones in the UFC and the falling out of Francis Ngannou, but there was a time when Dana White was saying that Jon Jones didn't want to fight Francis, and that was back when he wanted more money for fighting Francis. In 2020, before Ngannou had earned the title, everybody was excited about Jones moving up to heavyweight to fight the Predator, as was JBJ, who live tweeted his negotiations with the UFC for the move that almost immediately went south and had Jon vacate his belt at 205 and sit for 3 years. What was the problem?
I'll quote him and what he had said to my lawyer. Told my lawyer he wants what Deontay Wilder was paid.
While White would also praise Jones for being the best of all time during that same presser, he wasn't as complimentary after Ngannou captured the title, and Jon tweeted, "Show me the money."
If I'm Jon Jones and I'm home watching this fight, I start moving to 85.
So there you go. If you ever hear Dana say that it was all Francis and that Jones wanted the fight, he's technically not wrong about the last part. It was just for more money than the UFC was willing to pay, and they let everybody know about it at the time. 5 days after the clip I just showed you, though, things went south between the UFC and the other half of this equation. Number 6, Francis Ngannou. Now, there's no doubt that Francis Ngannou and the UFC are not on great terms these days, but they weren't on them when the man was heavyweight champion either. And while that entire contract saga had a lot of back and forth throughout, the most bus throwing was done to kick off UFC 265. So the situation at the time was this. According to Francis, 5 days after Ngannou defeated Stipe Miocic to become heavyweight champion, he was asked to take on Derek Lewis 2.5 months later. But a visa renewal process back in Cameroon would make that likely impossible, so he declined. But he said he could do the summer. The UFC told him that the summer was already booked up, only to ask him in late June if he could do a summer-August card. Assuming August was booked, because the UFC told him so, Ngannou said he wouldn't be ready in time, but could definitely do September. 5 days later, the UFC had announced that they'd be booking an interim title fight between Lewis and Cyril Gane for 265. Now, that alone was a bit odd considering he'd be ready a month later, but where the UFC threw Ngannou under the bus is at the start of the pay-per-view during the hype package. In it, Dana White appears saying, quote, "If you don't want to fight, no problem. You can wait and fly around the world on vacation. Whatever you're doing, knock yourself out. Whenever you're ready, we're here." The absolute burial of their heavyweight champion was completely scrubbed from existence after the initial live airing, but the damage was done and only further escalated things as we headed towards Ngannou's departure. Number 5, Tyron Woodley. In the middle of Tyron Woodley's welterweight title reign, the champion made a claim about being the worst treated champion in the UFC, and that he was not properly promoted alongside other black champions like Demetrius Johnson and Jon Jones. The subsequent backlash from his statements would eventually reach Dana White on ESPN Radio, where the UFC president would call his champion a drama queen and claim that race was not a factor in how fans or the promotion treated him, but that his attitude was his downfall. Comparing him to Conor McGregor, who he said would fight anyone anytime, White said, quote, "If Tyron Woodley had that attitude, Tyron Woodley would be a massive star. But he does these things where he'll say on Instagram where the fans know who's next, who's supposed to fight next, and he'll go on social media and he'll go, 'I'm not fighting him. I think I want to fight this guy.' And that's not what people want to hear." While it is true that Tyron Woodley did call for opponents like Nick Diaz randomly after he won the title, he also had some valid criticisms in his complaints. Nonetheless, the drama queen label would follow Woodley around, even though he and the UFC president would squash that beef. But new ones would pop up and Woodley would be buried again. Here's Dana White talking about his title defense against Damian Maia.
People don't want to watch you fight. You ask fans if they want to see Woodley fight again. I think that would be a flat-out no. Who wants to pay to see Tyron Woodley fight again?
Dan Hardy, stop the fight meme, my god. Number 4, Demetrius Johnson. A lot of the popular fan sentiment surrounding Demetrius Johnson's run in the UFC was that he was treated unfairly and not properly marketed as the star that he was. But I think much of that feeling stems from what happened towards the end of of his time in the promotion, because in reality, DJ was regularly placed in main events or co-main events on big network TV Fox cards. They did a whole season of Tough around the next guy to face him. So the UFC certainly put in effort trying to make Johnson appealing, but for one reason or another, fans just did not connect with 125. Where the promotion absolutely buried him was during the period that they wanted him to fight TJ Dillashaw. After Johnson published a letter explaining his issues with the UFC over pay, promotion, and the Dillashaw pressure, Dana White was stopped in the street by TMZ, and
I'm bullying you? How do you bully the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world? He has the lowest selling pay-per-view in the history of the UFC. The media claims he's the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. I think Conor McGregor is the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world.
What's even wilder about this clip is that 2 months earlier, White said that not only was Johnson pound for pound in the UFC, he was pound for pound, period. These days, if you say anybody but John Jones, Dana will literally fight you.
Are you guys that fucking stupid?
But that's not always been the case, as you can see. After DJ left, Dana was back to praising his former flyweight champ.
He never really got the love and the respect that he deserved from the fans, so hopefully he's a lot happier where he's headed now.
Number 3, Randy Couture. How is suing your heavyweight champion while they're champion for burying them? In 2007, the champ Randy Couture held a press conference announcing his resignation from the UFC.
I get no respect from the organization, and I'm tired of swimming upstream.
Strange thing to do as an independent contractor due to a whole host of issues with the promotion that were mostly related to money and somewhat related to not getting to fight Fedor. Randy's plan was to wait out his contract and then potentially do that fight. So then the UFC held their own presser where they handed out Randy's contract to show that he was paid well and that everything he was saying was a lie. They also called his resignation a pussy move. Randy Couture is the only champion in UFC history that the UFC held a press conference just to talk shit about.
The things that he said and the approach that he's taken and the way that he's done it, it's pretty shitty.
The two parties would end up embroiled in a legal battle that would eventually include Mark Cuban as well, and the UFC suing the shit out of Randy for breach of contract and all sorts of stuff. It was a big-ass, ugly mess, but you know how it goes. The little guy is never gonna win, and Couture pretty much had no recourse but to re-up with the UFC for a bit more cash and a bit more time. So that's exactly what he did. He was then subsequently mauled by Brock Lesnar.
Randy Couture comes off as the greatest guy in the world, Captain America. He's the furthest thing from it, and I'm happy to not be in business with him anymore.
Number 2, Tito Ortiz. Right after Tito Ortiz won the biggest fight of his career against Ken Shamrock to headline the biggest event in UFC history, he mentioned renegotiating his contract before agreeing to the white-hot fight with Chuck Liddell that was clearly the next big bout to make in the promotion. And with that brief microphone time, Tito's relationship would sour with the UFC brass and the fans. To put pressure on the champion, the UFC made their first ever interim title fight in hopes that it would buy them some time. After Liddell lost to Randy Couture for interim gold, Ortiz agreed to fight the new interim champion and subsequently lost his title and his leverage, so he finally fought Liddell afterwards with nothing on the line. In the years since this whole fiasco, the UFC has regularly brought forward the idea that Ortiz flat out didn't want to fight Chuck, that he was worried that he would lose, because as training partners, Liddell always got the better of it, and that he asked for absurd amounts of money, so he had an excuse to not fight the Iceman. And it is true that Ortiz asked for $150 and $150 for the bout, an amount that at the time would have probably not made too much sense for the UFC. So while the promotion wasn't wrong in their telling of the story's facts, they've certainly in interviews and documentaries over the years gone out of their way to emphasize that it was all Tito's fault and it was because he's a big scaredy cat. Number 1, John Jones again. The man is so nice that we had to talk about him twice. Now look, we normally don't do double entries on a list, but this time I'm making an exception because these scenarios were completely different from each other and happened at vastly different points in John's career. Not only that, but this is like the one time that John Jones didn't do anything wrong, but he caught hell for it all the same. Dana even brought the situation up when defending John's GOAT status to the media for the 1500th time.
The only real mark with John Jones when they were refusing to fight Chael Sonnen.
The situation was that UFC 151 was thinner than politicians' campaign promises. Am I right? Huh?
See, who said political comedy can't be fun?
No, but seriously, the card would be headlined by Jake Ellenberger versus Jay Haran if the main event somehow fell through, and guess what?
Dan Henderson has a partial tear in his MCL. He saw doctors and there was nothing we could do.
Now, Dana White will tell you that it was John Jones' fault for not accepting a fight with Chael Sonnen to replace his scheduled opponent, Dan Henderson, a week before the fight. In fact, in the official press release for the canceling of the event, the UFC literally wrote that 151 would be remembered as the event that Greg Jackson and John Jones murdered. This is also where the famous sport killer moniker came from for Jackson. But here's the thing. Dan Henderson injured his knee 3 whole weeks earlier and didn't bother to tell anybody until right before the fight because he thought he could tough it out and then he could. Well, that sounds like a pretty major part of why 151 was canceled, on top of the card having no stars but Jones and Henderson. I blame JBJ for a lot of things, but 151 is not one of them. You know who has never pulled out of a card? The editor of this video, Max Randall. The man does an amazing job. Please praise him on his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel. A big thank you to our channel Hall of Famers. You guys are the best. You're
Okay. Thank you for watching. You like the video? Hope you give me a like, probably subscribe. And out. Peace.